Yeah, I'm very delighted to welcome and to introduce one of the best friends of the OII and Oxford University, Dame Stephanie Shirley, who's Britain's first ambassador for philanthropy. We're very delighted to have you here, and you'll be chairing the panel, and she will introduce the other speakers. Thank you, Dame.
Thank you, Dave, very much. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Why are we here? I think with today's poor financial returns, there's an enormous emphasis on philanthropy because it's a way of actually investing for social return. And that's, I suppose, the background of my ambassadorship. I'm the first ever national ambassador in the world. And I have pledged not to sort of think something about the tax breaks and so on, but to inspire the idea that giving is a pleasurable act of desire as well as compassion to help change or challenge any aspect of society by raising the bar on our capacity to be generous. And as an evangelist, I am delighted to welcome you all to this public lecture on unleashing the potential of philanthropy, organised by the Oxford Internet Institute. And I should explain that IT was my professional discipline, and I set up a software house back in the dark ages when software was given away free with the hardware. And eventually that software house became successful, and I say eventually because it was 25 years before it ever paid a dividend. And I used part of my newfound wealth to sponsor the Oxford Internet Institute, and I'm enormously proud of it as a multidisciplinary institute for the social, legal, ethical, and economic aspects of the internet. In a sense, I look at it as everything but the technology. There's a by-invitation workshop and policy forum this afternoon, and I see some faces that are going to have both. And we look back at how generous people all over the world are now using information technology, sometimes even via their phones, for fundraising. But I do believe that they're not just important to the funds given, and their strategic impact is something I suppose we're trying to tease out today. My aim is to galvanise and encourage philanthropy in Britain. With the greater culture of giving in the United States, it's very stimulating to have an American speaker this morning. And after her address, she's very kindly offered to take questions. Dr. Lucy Bernholz of the New American Foundation. She was the first hand foundation philanthropy fellow at the Center for American Progress. Isn't that a wonderful title? And the name hand comes from the Arab proverb about one hand has no sound. She's written on e-philanthropy from a US perspective and has a strong international understanding of philanthropy as well. But she's not just an academic, she's an educationalist, Yale and Stanford, and has really made an impact worldwide. She's advised foundations and corporates on their grant-making strategies. She's founded the Californian Community Philanthropy Research Project. I expect she'll tell us about that. She's spearheading a new research project on philanthropy, working as a consultant to help apply its findings. And there's a lot of theory, you know, somebody like me, I want to make it happen. And she's listed for a long time, actually, in something I've never even heard of, the Directory of California Thinkers, which is absolutely lovely, and she's been there. You know. So please welcome our distinguished speaker, Dr. Lucy Bernholz.
Most people haven't heard of the Directory of California Thinkers, I don't think. Thank you very much, Dame Shirley. Thank you, Professor Dutton. all the wonderful staff of the Oxford Internet Institute, and all of you for coming. I'm really looking forward to this as an opportunity for me to learn from you as well as share. I want to thank the New America Foundation, the Hand Foundation, and Stanford University, all of whom make my work possible. I also want to thank my father for coming. It's a special honor for me to have him here with me on this journey. So first I want to start by asking you to do something slightly unusual, which is to please turn on your mobile phones. I know you all have them. You can turn both of them on. I'm asking you to do this. It's both a test of a theory I'm working on and a bit of an experiment. The theory is most of us don't use our phones for making phone calls anymore. So my theory is I can get through my half hour of remarks without anyone's phone ringing. It's not fair to call someone else in the room. I will buy tea or a pint for anyone whose phone legitimately rings during my remarks. But it's an experiment because this is the first time I've had a chance to do this outside of the States. So I can tell you this works incredibly well in Silicon Valley, but we'll see how it works in Oxford. We just don't use our phones in the way that we thought we would. We use them for texting and twittering, emails, IMs, but phone calls? I mean, heck, there ought to be an app for that. No, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. All right. Why do I bring this up? Just to make the point about how quickly technology changes. Here's a technology that's gone completely mainstream in the last 5 years. All of you have a mobile, some have two. About 4 billion of the 6 billion people on the planet have them. And while they were designed for phone calls, we use them for something else. When, that is, we can use them at all. Once the technology is in our hands, we start to adapt it. We adapt our behaviors to what it lets us do. We do this on an individual basis. Think, for example, of another thing about phone calls that's really quite significantly changed. You know, a decade ago, when the phone rang, you had no idea who was on the other end of the line until you answered it. But as soon as you answered it, and they identified themselves, there's a pretty good chance you knew where they were. So you didn't know who, but you knew where, because the chances are they were calling you from a landline. If it was mom, she was at home. If it was your sister, she was at work. If it was your brother, who knows where he was, if it's my brother. But once you knew who was calling, you had a pretty good chance of knowing where they were. But nowadays, the minute the phone rings, you know who it is. Caller ID tells you who it is. But the first question we ask is, hey, Dad, where are you? Because knowing who's on the call doesn't tell you anything about where they are. They could be at work, at home, in the car, in another country. We can no longer pin down our family or friends by their phone numbers. I actually have a hunch that this is why these new geotagging services, such as Foursquare and Gowalla, if you're familiar with them, why they're becoming so popular, especially among young people who've never been tethered by a landline. But that's for a different speech. So technology adapts to us, and we adapt to technology. It's very easy to see this on a personal level. It's a little bit harder to see it on an organizational level. But this is where we can begin to look at how technology is disrupting philanthropy. One more thing before I dive into that. Who remembers where you were at 10 p.m., I think 10 p.m. local time, January 12th, 2010? No one? Okay. I'll give you a hint. That's when the earthquake hit Haiti. Okay? Can you remember where you were now? How many of you first heard about the earthquake via your computer or your mobile phone? Wow. Quite a few, given that it was 10 o'clock at night here. How many of you first heard about it via the television, newspaper, or radio? Okay, so pretty evenly split, which I would actually posit part of that is because of the time. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon in California when it hit. When I asked that question in the States, either coast, the numbers are actually increasingly higher for folks finding out about it first on their mobile, on their desktop, via Twitter, Facebook, email, IM. They didn't have to turn on a radio. They didn't have to drive home and see it on the television. In fact, my favorite part of this story is the people who are most likely to have heard about it on television are those who work at the White House, because you have to turn off your mobile in the White House. So they had to wait till they got home. How many of you, after you heard about it, within the next day, say, then shared information about the earthquake via your mobile, Twitter, email, IM? So you spread the word to somebody. You became part of the news ecosystem about that event. How many of you made a donation via your mobile? This machine has allowed each of us, or many of us, not all of us in here, to become a vital part of the news ecosystem that greatly contributed to the vast outpouring of financial resources in response to that earthquake. It fundamentally changed the way each of us participated. We were no longer just receiving information, we were putting it out there, and we were also, in very rapid form, if you were actively engaged on Twitter or Facebook or email during those first few horrific days right after the earthquake, you could see in real time how major international aid organizations were changing the way they communicated back to us. Because people were demanding to know, where is the money I'm giving going? What is the Red Cross going to do with it? And the US Red Cross, I don't know if this is true in the UK, but the US Red Cross has had a heck of a decade. It's been a bad run for them. And they handled this response and their interaction with the millions of supporters in a way that has actually prevented what had become a cyclical backlash to the American Red Cross following every disaster. They completely prevented it. There has not been that backlash because they've stayed in touch, they've stayed in communication, they've built this very dispersed, uncontrollable, but completely connected network of people who probably gave no more than $5 or $10, but who feel invested now because they were engaged in real time and also as evangelists for the work of the organization they funded. We're all a part of this ecosystem now. Our mobiles let us talk to our friends or text with our friends, but they make us part of the news ecosystem. They help us to track the stories and help us to interact with the events in a way that has never been possible before on this kind of scale. Sure, it was possible in a neighborhood, but it was not possible on the scale it is now. And what we're going to see in the stories I'm going to tell is how that ability to interact at that pace and at that scale is fundamentally changing not just the organizations we count on to help deliver social goods and develop social solutions, but how we define the problems that we build those enterprises to address. I basically have only one point, and that is that data are the new platform for change. We now regularly access and use information at an entirely different scale and pace than ever before, due to the development of robust databases, search engines, mobile access points, your phone, and these geolocation services. And in the course of adapting to this new reality, several things are becoming clear. Data as a new platform for change allows for whole new forms of enterprises to produce social goods. We're only just beginning to see these forms. How many of you are familiar with Ushahidi? Okay, I'll talk about it a little bit more. How about crisis camps? A little bit, okay. But we can see these forms in things you may have heard about more present in the mainstream media. The role that Twitter played in the 2009 Iranian presidential election, Kyrgyzstan's one-day revolution last week, and the emergence of protest groups such as Priced Out here in the UK. These are new forms, new enterprises working on social challenges. Third influence of data. Mostly when we've thought about technology in the social sector, or technology and philanthropy, we've looked at this through the lens of fundraising and communications. But data as a new platform for change is about using the technology to define the problems and then develop the solutions. Technology as part and parcel of mission achievement, not just fundraising. So there's a series of points I want to make that stem from this data as the new platform for change point. It shifts everything, not just the enterprise form. It shifts where expertise lies. It's everywhere, not just within an organization. And by shifting where expertise lies, it allows for whole new forms of enterprises, whole new organizational structures, which then demand new forms of governance. New forms of enterprise, new forms of governance simply don't fit within the existing financing and regulatory structures, either here in the UK or in the States. Which is one reason that social enterprise and networks, informal networks, are happening now. The two major trends of this moment in time in philanthropy, the social enterprise movement, which if you're aware of the Skull World Forum happening down the street, is coming to a sense of some maturity, and the rise of these digital technologies are not coincidental, they are linked. This slide shows you, by the way, the logos of several major efforts from around, I looked for some in the UK and from around the world, where data being standardized and streamed in some way in an aggregate form are becoming the core asset of efforts to track money going to development. This is an effort funded, the subsidy scope is an effort funded by the Pew Charitable Trust. It's tracking all of the US federal government subsidies, sector by sector, industry by industry, including the nonprofit sector. So that ought to get a little bit of media attention when that data comes out. The Times Online is a wonderful example of how the newspaper business, which has been clobbered by digital technology in all kinds of directions, is actually also leading the way in trying to take data and tell stories from it, because that's what newspapers do. One of the things newspapers do well is tell stories, and this data-rich environment we're in now involves new ways of telling stories. I'm sure you're aware that your own fabulous resource, the Ordnance Survey, is beginning to make some of its data publicly available for free, and then you've got an open data effort in the UK. We're taking baby steps in that direction in the States as well. So it's mostly public data being used as a source for informing decision-making and making it available in a way that it's not, who does the analysis is not controlled by the organization that cleans up the data and makes it available. It's anyone who wants to. So, new enterprises, new governance, new financing, new regulations. Basically, the whole thing are the domains of influence where technology is fundamentally shifting how philanthropy works. Now, one quick caveat. Knowledge experts, information scientists get a lot of discussion out of the difference between data, information, and knowledge. I'm just going to skip over that. Okay? I'm not going to go down that rhetorical rat hole. I'm using data and information interchangeably, and I'm talking about both quantitative and qualitative data, numbers, and stories. We can have a drink later and talk about the difference. Our current common model of change is based around organizations. Nonprofits, registered charities, multilateral funding agencies, government bodies, political parties, they're the drivers of change, the issuers of manifestos. They do outreach to bring people in, or provide services to clients, or present art to audiences, or do research for others. But if you look at it as data becoming this new platform for change, this starts to change. Ushahidi, which I mentioned earlier, is an optimal example of this. It got its start in the elections in Kenya a few years back. The elections were highly contested. There were riots in the streets, there were protests, and there were a bunch of expats, Kenyan expats, who wanted to be able to get unbiased, unfiltered through the media understanding of what was happening. And they realized that, in fact, there was a profoundly diverse distributed source of data that they could tap into, which is the fact that the protesters and the rioters, the people on the streets, the voters, had mobile phones and could text messages about what was happening. And they have deployed a pretty basic SMS technology system that would pull those messages, aggregate them, display them on a single website, and allow anyone, the people on the street in Kenya, the expats in Copenhagen, people watching in South America, to see in real time what was happening. This is unedited raw news, if you will. The organization, Ushahidi, the word means testimony in Swahili, was not an organization. It was 3 people, 2 in Denmark and 1 in another African country, who were working together on Skype and all the free technology services to organize this and display it, but there was no there in terms of the way we think about philanthropy. There wasn't a board of directors, there wasn't an organization, there wasn't a building, there was none of that. There was a new application of an existing technology to a specific purpose. Different people saw different patterns in the data, but there was no clear dividing line between the inside and the outside. The people providing the messages, the people sending the messages, were as much a part of Ushahidi as were the people interpreting the website. This system has been adapted very rapidly to hundreds of other election monitoring campaigns around the world. It was used on Monday in Sudan in the Sudan Vote Monitor, and it was used in January when Washington, D.C. was hit with 3 feet of snow in 24 hours. The entire city was shut down. Washington, D.C. is not built for snow. It has maybe 1 snowplow in the greater metropolitan area. And what they realized working with the Washington Post, the local newspaper, they deployed the same system and allowed neighbors to say, hey, our street is still blocked. No snowplows come by. And track what became known locally as Snowmageddon. You know, we like hyperbole in the States. Its biggest test, its biggest use, and possibly why you've heard of it, is because the Ushahidi system went into work almost immediately, literally within hours of the earthquake in Haiti. And they started organizing systems whereby they worked with the phone networks to establish a single text number, 4636, and they put the word out through their existing networks so that anyone in Haiti, be they, I mean, in the first few hours, there were relief workers there for other reasons, but the Haitians could text to that number, I'm in this place and the walls have come down, trucks can't get by. And then the aid workers who started arriving in countries started using it. And within a matter of days, this crowd-based technology system that was being managed in terms of the technology receiving end by a group of volunteers in Massachusetts was being used by the US State Department and major multinational relief organizations to actually coordinate how they responded to the devastation in Haiti. They also quickly realized that while they'd set up a number, 4636, most of the tweets were coming in, the texts or the tweets were coming in Creole, which wasn't of great use to most of the English-speaking relief workers. And because this is an entirely network distributed system, they then quickly began working on, as soon as they recognized the problem, they put out the word, we need a Creole English translation capacity, and volunteers got to work adapting existing Creole English translation tools and dictionaries to be launched on iPhones and other smartphones so that that translation could happen fast enough that the coordination could actually happen. So think about that, all those uses of that tool and that approach to a problem. And who is Ushahidi? Is it the volunteers in Kenya and Massachusetts who staff the data and web systems? The people on the ground in Haiti, both quake victims and aid workers? The government agencies and relief organizations that started using the data from the system to coordinate the work? And the answer, obviously, is it's all of the above. It's an adaptable tool. They've powered Snowmageddon, they've done the Sudan Vote Monitor, And this approach to thinking about where the expertise lies is being replicated in a number of instances that aren't particularly technology-driven, but are recognizing that the real power, the real important information sources are actually not within an organization, but outside of one. There's an organization in Minneapolis called Watch, which trains citizens to monitor court proceedings, so that there was a sense that particularly domestic violence cases weren't getting treated fairly in the courts, and this wasn't being covered by the newspapers. They trained a group of citizens to monitor the courts and began to collect the data and use the real expertise of simply engaged citizens to shape the way that issue was monitored locally. Following Hurricane Katrina in the States a few years back, and now trying to get it off the ground in Haiti, is a recognition. You may be experiencing this personally now. It's been several months since the earthquake in Haiti. Obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done there, but what's going on now? And a group called Disaster Accountability Project is now deploying this kind of citizen-based monitoring to report to any and all about why is there a big box of relief supplies over here, but the folks are over here, or why have this group received food, but this group hasn't, so that, again, the actual work is being done by the expertise that's in the crowd and on the ground. It's an important change because rather than an organization that's focused on delivering a set of services, Ushahidi is a set of tools that can be adapted to situations and used by almost anyone. Expertise is internal and external. Everyone is is potentially both a provider and a client, and data are what is powering the change. It also represents the social application of technology and data for uses far flung from their original intended purposes. It shows a fundamentally new way of thinking about social challenges and problem solving. The model relies on the end beneficiaries, the quake victims or the voters, making the system work. You might be familiar with this guy. He's a local. Recognizing these subtle but important ways that technology alter our behavior and expectations about information is key to really understanding the kinds of new solutions that Ushahidi represents. Rather than organizations as sources of expertise, funding, and programs that get delivered or that get pushed out into communities, beneficiaries and activists are drawing together, are pulling in, being pulled in by their shared interests and needs and capacities. They are designing solutions together, they're funding them together, they're developing new tools together, and then they're deploying those tools out usually into an open source environment so that they can be repurposed and redeployed. The change that really matters, the disruptive change, the impact of technology on philanthropy, is this way in which technology shifts our definitions of problems and the way we imagine solutions. A shift of this magnitude, one in which expertise is everywhere and must be pulled together, solutions are flexible, and scale is likely to be global, is not going to come from within our existing charitable, nonprofit, or philanthropic organizations. These are adapting some of the possibilities of the tools, but they're always going to be a patchwork of add-ons. What we're seeing is a explosion of flexible, network-based efforts built for the tools and mindsets of today. One other example besides Ushahidi are the crisis camps that are still in some places going on, again, to address the devastation in Haiti. These are loosely networked, locally based, volunteer efforts focused on developing technology-based solutions that can help coordinate relief, in this case, in this instance, for the devastation in Haiti. They started immediately after the earthquake, the very first weekend after the earthquake. They got underway in London and Bogota and Ottawa and San Jose. They used a local coordinator who rounded up a group of peers. They were supported primarily with caffeine and pizza by local corporations. And they started to build a template, or work off a template that their kind of host organizing committee, which is a group called Crisis Commons, had already designed. It's a set of wikis, a template for project management, and a shared website for uploading what you've done. Basically, we would get together, we'd find out who in this room is interested in building what solution. What problem do you see? What resources do you know exist? And what do you think needs to be built? And that side of the room would say, it's this Creole English issue. We really need a better translation tool. And that side of the room might say, no, you know what it is? We've got masses of aid organizations and masses of donors, and we have no way to match them. And someone else would say, no, you know what it is? It's that I'm standing around at the bus stop with this tool in my hand, and I want to be useful. What can I do? And someone recognizing that there were tens of thousands of photographs being emailed out of the country that would have a picture of a fallen building and a little boy. And computers can do a lot of things, but they can't look at that photo and say, it's a fallen building and it's a little boy with brown hair and soccer shirt from some famous soccer player, not my sport obviously, but they can't identify the details of the photo that needed to be identified. But I can do it with my phone, standing there waiting for the bus. So they created a photo tagging system that allowed me to look at the picture, punch in all the proper keywords. All of that was uploaded to a massive database called People Finder, and relatives of Haitians, friends of Haitians in country were able to scan this database now by the kinds of keywords that they would likely use and find their relatives. And I was part of that solution from my cell phone while I waited for the bus. That's what Crisis Camps was all about. That's the kind of completely networked, web world inspired set of solutions that has no nonprofit status, no board of directors, no fundraising campaign, just the mission. And they're still rolling out. As my projects in Silicon Valley, Saturday night came along, we were blotted out on pizza and coffee. What we'd accomplished was uploaded to the web, and the next crisis camp group in a place where daylight was just beginning could take that work on and continue it. So it started to work 24 hours around the clock, and there was no central organizing body behind this. These kinds of projects, by the way, have proven themselves for years now as being incredibly successful and effective in time-limited ways. They're very good for protests. It's easy to organize people and build something quickly and not have to have a centralizing body. One of the big questions for all of us looking forward over the next few years is, what is the ecosystem going to look like between our large established enterprises, our big registered charities, and our small registered charities, and our structures, and these kinds of fluid temporal networks. One thing we do know, though, is that those kinds of networks, some of them will simply dissipate. They won't continue. They'll make a difference, and people will move on. Some of them may try to establish themselves as registered charities, but some of them will no doubt seek to go the route of a social enterprise, a market-based solution to a social problem. I mean, again, point down the street at the Skull World Forum, there is a natural alignment between the kinds of people who are attracted to the global potential of technology, lightweight technology-based solutions, and social entrepreneurs who are looking for systemic, scalable, global change. There's a natural affinity there, and what we see here is that even the earliest efforts of the social enterprise movement funded by Skoll from the days of Benetech, which is a social purpose technology company, to the newest Skoll awardees who are being announced, I think, as we speak, which include an organization called Vision Spring, which has developed a scalable business model for producing very, very low cost variable lens eyeglasses for the developing world. I can tell you, having just spent $500 on mine, I could use a pair of low-cost variable lens eyeglasses. But wherever individuals are looking for these large-scale solutions to social challenges, that entire social enterprise movement, they are finding technology is core to their mission. And in the case of social enterprise, technology is also core to the financing. Because these enterprises are fundamentally trying to provide a social mission through a market-based enterprise, they have to report out on two different streams of information. They need the basic financial return information, which several hundred years of capitalism have given us all kinds of tools for that. But they need another set of metrics to document the social return. The measurements themselves and the tools for reporting them that social enterprise is using is fundamentally built around massive databases, cloud-based storage and reporting sites, and increasingly mobile applications that engage participants as the data source. These tools then are leading to web-based exchanges that allow financial investments in social enterprise. They're actually a fairly natural evolution of the last decade's rise in online giving marketplaces. They've become data-rich repositories about social projects. What's happening is we're beginning to see these kinds of marketplaces for giving become places where the data that's used to incite the gift, the financial support, also generates data about the patterns and trends of the projects, the patterns and trends of the human conditions, and yes, patterns and trends in philanthropic support. So just as the phone became a handheld computer, the investment we made communally over the last decade in online giving marketplaces is beginning to yield fruit in what I term the new infrastructure of social goods. We're seeing, particularly in aid data and IATI, which is the International Aid Transparency Initiative, efforts to mine the data trail that these transactions generate as a way to actually improve the work itself. Ben Metz, who is hosting Oxford Jam down the street across from Skoll, former head of Ashoka UK, has actually just completed a really well done map of the social enterprise, social financing systems in the UK. It's online at benmetz.org, benmetz.org, and it's an example of just how complicated these ecosystems of who produces social goods have become and how the financing has followed along hand in glove with that. It's I don't want to make too much of this, but this relationship between the diversification of forms to produce social goods and the role that technology plays, I believe are very closely linked. They're not coincidental, and in fact, they're mutually influential, so that we're going to start seeing this kind of generative next ripple out use of some of the systems we've built is just going to become more and more of our reality. So systems that were designed to facilitate philanthropic giving are giving birth, if you will, to whole new systems of information about looking at problems and whole new systems for actually moving different kinds of money to the enterprises that are doing the work. I mentioned before that these new ways of working, both social enterprise and networks, need different kinds of governance. They fundamentally don't fit in the structures we require of nonprofits. It's not easy to do rapid prototyping, A/B testing, and crowdsourcing of crisis information if you've got to run everything by a board of directors. So people are creating these things, and they're not structuring them to fit within the mandated and allowed systems that we're used to. What they are doing, the one new governance structure ethos that I see out there that's starting to take some hold. I mean, I think we're actually in a period of invention of new governance structures, but one that is definitely at work is driven by and underpinned by the work of Creative Commons, which has given birth to the Science Commons, to organizations like Crisis Mapping, to We Are Media, which are all efforts to pool resources. I build what I build, I contribute it to the greater good, I can take what you've built, modify it, and put it back. It's a share and share alike ethos. It underpins the open source software movement, and we are in fact beginning to see social good producing organizations that are structuring themselves to work this way. This is the root. We have no idea what the plant is going to look like yet, but this is the root of what I believe will be whole new sets of governance structures guiding the way social goods are produced. The other side of that equation, the other place we see whole new corporate structures, are here in the UK, you've got the CICs. In the US, we've got a newly registered form called the B Corporation. We have something called the L3C. These are actually legitimate revisions to the corporate code that says this kind of organization is approved to be producing both financial returns and social goods. This is how we're going to monitor it. We're actually going to change the governing structures for how we invest in these organizations, how we monitor them, how they report, so that this can be allowed to grow. This is actually quite significant. In the States, for the last 100 years, there have been two diametrically opposed options. You could be a for-profit company, you could be a not-for-profit organization. And now we have code-level changes. Corporate code in the US is mandated at the state level, so this has to go across 50 states. It's not a federally regulated thing. But it is beginning to happen. There's about, if you look at the two different forms there, you're looking at almost about 15 or 20 states that have approved these changes in the last couple of years. And let me make one thing clear about US regulatory reality. It's probably not going to come as a shock to anybody. It's one thing to futz with the corporate code. It's another thing to futz with the tax code. And that's where this is going to become very visible, very public, very political. And it's coming, because the organizations that are being chartered in the US as B Corps or L3Cs are very quickly going to start asking, why are they competing against tax-benefited organizations? And there will be, I don't know how it will play out, I'm not a oracle, but there will be a very messy fight soon about the tax codes and how we structure work for social good in the US. I had no idea this had all this zippy animation in it. So, the other thing to think about from that policy standpoint is that work is happening on these global levels. This is not, while some of the work can happen locally, the structures that support them are locally. Wikipedia, the Mozilla Foundation, which makes your browser, and Kiva are all registered nonprofits, but they all work globally. And this has significance because most nonprofits, in the States at least, have started locally, and some have aspired to and over time tried to grow either through replication or franchising, take some kind of steady state growth regionally and maybe nationally. But now we've got proof that some of this work can be done from a global scale to begin with. And I think that's going to fundamentally change, again, how we think about social problems. It definitely factors in this area of financing these enterprises. I mentioned earlier that the need for social enterprises to document their social impact in a way that nonprofits have never been asked to do with the kind of regular reporting and the kind of exactitude is going to lead to not just new standards for reporting, but once those standards are built, we're seeing these investment exchanges, stock exchanges for social enterprises, where you can invest in the enterprise that is producing the social good and help move the money from, in the case particularly, for example, of Impact Investment Exchange Asia, the goal here is to help move money from the global north to enterprises in the global south that can document their financial return and their social return. This is a whole new approach to thinking about where social goods happen. And again, they're generative. This is not an end game, it's a beginning game. Once you start having massively similar metrics, whether they're good or bad metrics, but massively similar metrics that allow you to make comparisons, you change the behavior of how people look for information, what they look for, how they compare organization A to organization B. and the scale of philanthropists that can engage in the biggest issues of our day. I'll give you an example. In the medical disease research field, there's an organization in the US called Faster Cures, which is essentially focused in on the various medical disease research organizations, disease by disease, malaria, prostate cancer, autism, myelin repair, and rank these organizations, engage the organizations in developing the system, and they now have a functioning database where any donor or any investor, whether you're talking about somebody making a $25 gift or a pharmaceutical company looking to make a $25 million investment, can read this information and assess these organizations on this same system. Fundamentally changes the landscape of how medical disease research organizations are going to be funded in the US going forward. This is all happening because of the kind of innovation that's gone on for the last 10 years by social venture capital firms, research organizations into social finance, these emerging, this is a global social investment exchange, and some of the research happening down the street. These exchanges, I think it's obvious, also make some fundamentally, they're built on technology, they're built on that robustness and that global scale. All right, let me jump ahead here. All of this is a way of saying that what we might once have thought was a fairly defined universe of government dollars, philanthropic dollars, nonprofit organizations or registered charities, some corporate giving, that picture is not the ecosystem we operate in anymore. Most of the innovation over the last 10 years, globally and certainly in the States, has been about sort of breaking out of those boundaries, whether it be the creation of new enterprises, these new forms of governments, these new technology platforms, the new uses of data, and the new uses of financing. And what that leads me and my colleagues at Stanford to be working on is a recognition that when you think about how that will grow, how that will actually be effective and make a difference in the world, that whole, the landscape, not any particular enterprise in it, but that whole, first thing we need to do is understand all of the different policy domains that now influence that work. I'll give you a very specific example. If you talk to foundations in the US, grant-making foundations in the US, and you ask them, does the work of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is our federal board for overseeing the investment industry, does the work of the SEC have any bearing on your work? You'll get one of two answers. No. Or, I don't know, ask the investment guy. But in reality, those investment exchanges that I showed on the last slide, both NEXI and the Asian Impact Investment Exchanges, are SEC-regulated entities. The SEC is right in their backyard. If foundations want to start working with those exchanges, they'd better understand that they're now falling under the regulatory purview of a set of actors that they probably thought had no bearing whatsoever on their work. Similar issue with the whole regime of intellectual property and who owns what. If you think about the Creative Commons movement and those commons as governance structures I mentioned earlier, that's not a marginal issue. It's a very central issue. I believe that open data access and net neutrality are two of the key policy issues for philanthropy in the States, yet there are very few people who can either say those words in that order or have any idea what they mean when you do put them in that order. It's not on their radar screen. So the policies matter. This is actually an initial brain dump that we developed. Sorry you can't read it very well, where we tried to identify just the policy domains that influence philanthropic giving and those that influence impact investing. And the idea behind this is, since most of the regulations that matter assuming once we start to identify the right large categories, tax codes, donor intent case law, corporate law, should have impact investment practicing over here. Once we get those large domains identified, we're working to identify in-country experts who can figure out, well, what are the issues for the tax code, for example, in the UK? What are the investing exchange issues from a US perspective? What does this look like in South Africa, where 30% of all giving is driven actually by corporate supply chain rules? Get the local experts to help populate this and begin to build a map collectively that will allow people both to share ideas across borders, and also just so that we can see the entire picture and understand where there may be major roadblocks to big change, or where there are areas where they're going about this in such a different way that it has useful lessons for those of us who are looking at policy locally. So that's something that's going to sort of begin to move forward. The point being, it's not just tax code anymore. It's much more complicated than that. So all of this is about saying that the real potential of e-philanthropy is about much more than using email or Twitter to raise money for social goods. Those changes, as slow as their adaptation may seem, will certainly come. Clay Shirky, an American media studies professor and author of the book Here Comes Everyone, is noted for having said, technology only gets useful once it gets really boring. Once the technology is really background, and we all know how to use a mobile phone, then we start doing really interesting things with it. When it's new and different and we have to be led by the early adopters, it doesn't make a big difference yet. So those changes will come. And there are important lessons to be learned about how to use them well and how to integrate Twitter campaigns into your major donor campaigns. But part of the reason that adaptation has been episodic, I believe, is because for the most part, we've thought about it as being part of a fundraising and communication practice, not about being critical to the core mission of the organizations. It's been a sidebar, so it's been adapted in a sidebar kind of way. And the position papers that many of you submitted, I was quite struck by your reflections on that in the UK. I'll give you 3 examples that I think are interesting here. 3 businesses that over the last decade has become painfully, I guess, would be the adjective I'd use, painfully obvious how disruptive technology can be. Libraries, newspapers, and the musical recording business. Of those 3 industries, libraries, which I could find for you a stack of reports this high, written in the 1980s and early 1990s, all of which would say the internet will be the end of librarians. We don't need the search engines are the end of libraries, and the internet and digital books are the end of libraries. And a lot of librarians reacted defensively, they didn't take to the technology, yada, yada, yada. If you look at libraries now, yes, there's still that are not really engaging with this stuff, but for the most part, in communities in the Netherlands, in the States, here in the UK, all over the place, here at Oxford, there are librarians who have jumped into this digital world in such a way that they've completely recreated both where librarianship happens. Not only have they not been killed off by search engines, we need librarians now more than ever. Now more than ever. An example of an industry and a profession which engaged with these technologies and reinvented the core mission of their work to use these tools, both old and new. Why is that possible? At least partly because for librarians, and again, this is a state's perspective, the initial threat of the digital technology was not to the revenue source of the library, but to the core purpose. And so it was absolutely critical. They could dawdle only so long, had to figure out how to take advantage of these technologies. And I would argue that librarians and libraries in the US have done a far better job of adapting digital technologies to the core of their work than the newspaper business or the recording industry. which are still kind of diddling around trying to figure out how to use them to raise money and sell things, but are only really beginning to touch how can I use these tools to do my work better? Not just how can I replace my lost advertising revenue, but how can I do reporting in a new way? That's brand new, and this is 2010. And that question was raised in 1990. So they're not exactly on the cutting edge, which is only to say nonprofits may be episodic and slow, but they're in very good company. The point here, data is the platform for change. The real potential comes from looking beyond these questions of revenue and outreach to this, how these tools can help us define problems in new ways and imagine new solutions, solutions that are flexible, adaptable, global in scale, for which the expertise lies outside any particular organization, and for which an ongoing organization may or may not be necessary. From the tools that we've developed, because we now carry phones in our pockets that we don't talk on, and because we know who's calling us, but we don't know where they are, the recognition that the phones serve as tagging devices that can tell you where someone is, all of this actually puts a very different spin on some very core assumptions, and it's when we begin to shape our problems and our solutions from those assumptions that I think we will really see the manifestation of the unleashed potential of e-philanthropy. So I thank you for your time. Looking forward to the responses.